We know that watercolor can be applied to dry paper, producing sharp, defined strokes, and also to wet paper, creating gorgeous transitions and blends. But what if I told you that the real magic happens in between? That relatively short period of time between wetting your paper and the water being absorbed is when you can really get into some magical effects that are not possible with any other medium. Today I'm going to show you a simple exercise that will help you get to know your watercolor surface so you can approach this technique with confidence. First, I will show you a basic version, and then we will talk about some tools and tricks that will help you control the drying time even better. If you're following me on YouTube or Patreon, you know that our June watercolor tutorial is this cockatoo with lily flowers, where we practice working with this so-called delayed or timed wet on wet to create beautiful soft feathers and lily petals. And so this exercise that I'm about to show you is a good foundation to get us started. What you need is a small piece of watercolor paper, the same one you will be using for your main painting, because each brand has different properties and amount of cotton, and you want to learn the timing that works for your unique set of papers. So I'm using Arches cold pressed. I know that it's expensive and I saved the last sheet on my blog. Trust me, it will be worth it, as you will observe me for a couple of minutes and learn how to get to know your supplies much better. So I'll start by making a grid with 4 rectangles in a row so we can time our strokes in equal intervals. Let's start the timer and cover the paper with water. Flat brushes work best for this, and I'm using my new Chronos from Escoda. It's synthetic sable, very good brush. And once you have this entire top part covered, let's wait for 1 minute and 30 seconds, so 1.5 minutes, so the water has a chance to sink in. Notice that if you're using 50% cotton paper or a different brand from the one I'm using, it may start drying a lot faster, which is okay. Just cut this initial time of absorption in half, or maybe even down to 30 seconds. I find it very helpful to lift my paper and shake it slowly to make sure that water is evenly distributed as much as possible. This is important for the times when you paint on larger surfaces and you want your drying time to be even throughout. Not as important when you paint on smaller sections. At 1 minute and 30 second mark, I will use my small round brush and do a long wavy stroke using transparent staining color, quinacridone red in this case. Any quinacridone will work very well for this, and I'm using red because it will be the main color for our lily petals, and I want to understand the exact timing for this specific pigment, but use any of your favorite pigments to test. Notice how fast and how far your pigment will flow. Most likely it will blend almost to the border of the first rectangle. Then 1 minute later, at 2.5 minute mark, I will do another stroke, and here I expect to see a bit less flow and more definition, but as you can see, it's only precise up on top where my brush still had a lot of fresh paint. Then later, as I move down, less pigment particles on the brush, and so less definition, more of a blend. Let's wait a full minute and do another stroke. It still spreads pretty far, but doesn't dissolve entirely, and this would be very useful for soft effects on greenery, for example, where you want to have very natural looking organic effects, or for our first couple of strokes on the lily petals. Let's put another test stroke a minute later, and somehow even at a 4.5 minute mark, the paint still spreads, and the big reason is of course cotton. It's taking a long time to absorb the water, so it might be different depending on your cotton composition and the type, the brand of paper you're using. Also note that I'm using cold pressed, which always takes longer to dry compared to hot pressed. As I continue applying my strokes at even intervals, only at about 7.5 minute mark, we can start seeing some definition. And I obviously sped up the video to make it less boring, but when you're testing your paper, notice the timing, especially that point when your strokes stop spreading as fast and you can leave more precise marks with a soft blend, because those are the softest, most wonderful strokes you will ever make. And for the lilies in our June tutorial, this is precisely when we switch to more permanent color, alizarin crimson, and start working on petal veins, wet into wet, right before the water is fully absorbed, so you don't see as much paint spreading and the lines are much more defined. As you can see, I was able to paint these until almost 10-minute mark, and then my brush strokes started looking too sharp, and that's the end of this magical in-between time. Once again, depending on your paper, it will be longer or shorter. Simply take note of the drying time and get used to playing with your color this way. It's a real game changer for botanical art, bird painting, or anything else you can think of. Now I will tell you about the 3 things that you can adjust to get better at this technique and control it even more. Number 1, play with the surface area. The smaller it is, the faster the drying time. In this strip, which is half the size of the one we just did, my timing was cut in half because I was working on the area that was much smaller. And when you're working on small sections like in this painting, note the difference. You will have a lot less time to work, but also will spend a lot less time waiting to complete every section. Number 2, if you want to extend the drying time and improve pigment flow, use Watercolor Medium. My favorite is synthetic ox gold from the brand Core, but there are many different mediums on the market, and just a few drops in your water jar can double the amount of time. So in this exercise that I did on fluid cold pressed paper, you can see in the bottom row my paint was spreading way past the 20-minute mark. This medium is very useful if you work slowly, or if you find that your paper is always drying too fast, maybe because you are in a dry climate, as I hear from some of my followers, this is sometimes an issue. Lastly, the effects of gravity are super cool, although sometimes tricky to control. You can see in this last version of the exercise, I tilted my page so the top part was drying much faster, while the bottom part where the water is being pulled to, my paper surface is staying wet a lot longer, my paint is spreading a lot faster and further and for a much longer period of time. So in summary, the more drying time you give yourself, the less pigment will spread and your strokes will look more and more defined. How much time you have will depend on your paper brand, and it may even differ from one watercolor block to another or one sketchbook to another. Play around with the timing, the amount of water you have on paper, and also your brush to see if you notice any difference. Remember that results can always be a bit unpredictable, so don't worry if you don't get it right the first time. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and do share this video if you have a friend artist who may find it helpful. And of course, it really helps my channel, and I appreciate all your likes and shares, and thank you for those of you who subscribe. Once you have a good feel for how much time you have with your supplies, you can follow me on Patreon in real time as we paint this bird and lilies. Thank you for watching and painting with me. I will see you next week.